This year marks 10 years that I have been married to my wife. But some people don't know this. When she was 16, we grew up together in a church. And when she was 16, I told her, I was 19 at the time, a little odd, but I told her that I was going to marry her, that I believed that God was telling me that I was going to be married to her. She laughed. But 4 years later, close to 4 years later, I proposed to her. We were at Lee University at the time. When I proposed, there was this gazebo there on the campus that I proposed to her. We had a friend of ours, her roommate at the time, who was traveling with us throughout Cleveland. She was taking photos of us, doing all these, guy-girly, romantic photos stuff. I was being dragged around, but really I was the one orchestrating it. And so we got to the gazebo after a long day of photos, and my wife and I had our backs to each other. And after Lauren, her roommate, took the photo, I got up and I leaned over to pick her up because she was obviously sitting on the ground. And when I leaned over to pick her up, the ring popped out of my pocket. Yeah, and I had a long script that I was going to share. My undying love and all that stuff. And so as the ring pops out, I just stare at her, bag of the ring, stare at her, bag of the ring. And it seemed like an eternity had went on. And so then I got on my knee, proposed. She said yes, celebrating 10 years. But that's my version of it. But if you were to ask my wife, her version, she spins it a little bit differently. Because the gazebo was what I thought was a romantic place, but I guess I had missed out on some of the undertones that my wife was sharing as we were getting closer and closer, as she knew this day was coming. And so I missed all the hidden signs that the gazebo was not the place to do it. This was a popular place where many people at Lee would get proposed at. This was also a popular place where guys would bring their guitars. It was right next to the girls' dormitory, and the guys would play the guitars. Wasn't me. You don't want me playing a guitar or singing, for that matter. But they would sing, and the girls would raise their windows up and listen to the guys playing the guitar. So it was kind of a romantic spot. But I missed it. I missed the undertone of my wife saying, "I really don't want you to propose there." I did. She still said yes. We're still celebrating 10 years. Thank goodness, because I remember myself 10 years ago, and I don't know why she said yes. I'm thankful that she said yes. And then the photographer, she has a version as well, because she saw it coming. She could see the anxiety in my face, the sweat. She knew what was coming down the pipe, and so she has a different version of the story. And over the next 10 weeks, we're going to be looking at 4 books in the Bible that I believe change everything we know about the Bible. We're going to be talking about the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gospels are a lot like my proposal story. There's different versions, but basically all of them point to the same thing. Just like my version, my wife's version, and the photographer's version. All those versions lead to her saying yes and us being married 10 years. Just like in the Gospels. All the stories, different versions, different things, but they all lead to the same thing. So before we get into the Gospels, let's do a little bit of homework. The Old Testament, it's comprised of 39 books of the Old Testament. There's roughly 3,400 years from Adam and Eve to Malachi. There's several different authors throughout that time. After the Old Testament, it's followed by a period it's called the intertestamental period. It's the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's about roughly 400 years of silence that God does not speak to anybody during that time. There's no prophets. There's nothing that goes on the scene. There's no records of anything happening in regards to God speaking to people during that time. During that time, about 63 BC, that's before Christ comes on the scene, the Romans took over the world, basically. They had a Roman Empire, and they took control. They were at war for many years, and around 63 BC, they decided, we're going to stop going to war, we're going to stop advancing our kingdom lengthwise, and we're going to advance our kingdom within. And we're going to build things, and we're going to invent things. And so they built what we would call a road. They started building roads all throughout the Roman Empire to bring everything easier to travel, easier to get to and from, which is very important to when Jesus shows up. It's very important to when the Gospels are written that the roads were built so that the message could be carried out. The Romans also invented a thing called the Codex. The Codex is basically the first book, the way that we see books. Because beforehand, the Old Testament was written in long scrolls, really long scrolls, and it was hard to translate, it was hard to read, it was hard to maneuver, it was hard to transport, and so there was very minimal copies of the Old Testament. And so when the Romans came along, they said, we're gonna do something a little bit different, and so they invented the Codex, which is basically like sheets of paper. It wasn't paper, but sheets of paper, and they would bind them together, and they would make a book. And so it made it easier to transport. And so you had the Codex, and you had the road that was invented roughly around the time that Jesus shows up, around the time roughly that the Gospels were written, which made the gospel message a whole lot easier to transport, a whole lot easier for the message to go across the known world at that particular time. And so when Malachi ends his book, it's the last book in the Old Testament. When he writes this last book, you see that God is using Malachi to declare 4 messages in his book. The first message is all about God's love. He's telling the Israelites, I love you. I love you. God knows it's his last message. He knows this is going to be the last time that he speaks to the Israelites for 400 years. And so he's telling them, I love you. My love for you is enduring, it's lasting. But also, he also calls them out. He calls the priest out for sinning. He calls the Israelites out for their sin and their involvement and their love for sin. And so I always find it interesting through Scripture, you see God telling, I love you, but. You know, it's kind of like a parent where, hey, I know I'm going to have to spank you, but I love you. I want to tell you that before I do it. I love you, but. And so you see that through Scripture, and so this is no different in the book of Malachi. That Malachi is writing this message saying, God loves you, but you're sinning. You're living in sin, and you're not being able to be used by God the way that God wants you to be used. And so the fourth piece of the book of Malachi is all about Jesus. It has everything to do with his coming. Like I said, he knows this is his last message. And he says in Malachi 3 that I'm going to send somebody. I'm going to send somebody who's going to be a messenger, who's going to go before the Messiah. Because 3,400 years, they've been waiting for this Messiah to appear. And so Malachi is saying that there's going to be a messenger. There's going to be somebody that's going to come and clear the path for the Messiah. And he's doing this, God is telling Malachi to write this down because during this 400 years, there are several people that raise up in power and leadership, and they say, well, maybe this is the next guy. Maybe this is the Messiah. Maybe this is the guy that we've been waiting for. Maybe this is the guy that all the prophets talked about. But they would always be able to go back to Malachi 3 and say, there was no messenger. There was nobody before him. There was nobody clearing the path for him. And so in Malachi 3:1, you see the actual verse. It says, look, I am sending my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, which is a reference back to the book of Isaiah 40, where it says that this messenger will live in the wilderness. And there's other verses about John the Baptist, who is the messenger in the Gospels, that he will eat locusts and honey. You know, it's kind of weird, right? Anybody like locusts and honey? Anybody just sounds appetizing? Well, there's prophecies about this messenger, about John the Baptist and how he is going to clear the way. That you will know my son, you will know my rescuer, you will know my Messiah by the messenger. Because the messenger will come and clear the way. It says again, Malachi 3:1, look, I am sending my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. Then the Lord you are seeking will suddenly come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant, whom you look for so eagerly, is surely coming. And so Malachi is just reaffirming, hey, he's coming. The guy we've been waiting for, he's on the way. The person we've been seeking, he's about to enter. He's about to come. And then you flip a couple pages, and then you see the Gospels emerge. The book of Matthew. Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. And of all the things that Matthew opens up with, he opens up with Jesus' genealogy, which seems kind of odd to us, but it's very interesting because Matthew is writing to the Jews, which in this time frame, the Jews are very important. They are the people that have influence around the Israelites. They are the people that have influence over God's message. And so these are the important people. These are the people that would know Malachi 3:1. And they would know that there's somebody coming. And so they would be paying attention to these things. And the reason why Matthew starts with the genealogy is because the Israelites cared so much about their heritage. They cared about the genealogy. They cared about where people came from. And so Matthew wrote his genealogy back from Jesus all the way to Abraham. And it's to assert his social position as an Israelite. It's to assert who he is. Because there's no way that Jews would listen to somebody about God's message that wasn't an Israelite at that time. And so Matthew made it very clear from the get-go, from the first verse in Matthew, that here is Jesus, here's his family, here's his lineage, here's his history. This is who he belongs to. He is a true Israelite. And then when Matthew provided in Jesus' history line David, it was also to underscore that he was of royal blood. That he become from royal ancestry. That he belonged to royal family. And so Matthew outlines the genealogy, which a lot of times we skip over, don't we? Especially in the Old Testament, this person begat this person begat. We skip over that. But there's reason why there's genealogy. And this genealogy is very important for the reading of the Gospels. It's very important for us to understand why Matthew is writing this. Because Matthew is telling the reader, which at this point were the Jews of the day, saying, Jesus is important. This guy has royal blood. This guy belongs in the social circles. This guy belongs to be listened to. We need to be listening to him. We need to be paying attention to him because what he is saying is important because of his past. Matthew and Luke are the only books out of the four Gospels that have genealogy. And this is where my proposal story comes into play. Because all the books are different. All four of them are different. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're called the Synoptic Gospels, which means that they are of the same vision. So you'll see a lot of the same stuff in them, but you'll also see a lot of stuff that's not there. You'll see it in Matthew, but you won't see it in Mark. You'll see it in John. You won't see it in Luke. And so it's all mixed in together, but it's all the same thing, telling the same story about the same guy, about Jesus. And each of the synoptic Gospels concentrates on Jesus' ministry in Galilee. And they write through this viewpoint of the writer. The writer is writing this story, telling you about Jesus through their perspective, how Jesus influenced them, and how they want his message to influence the reader. And so that's why the writer has written certain ways. Matthew, he presents Jesus as the Messiah, as the King. He writes from the Hebrew point of view. Mark, he was a missionary. And so he wrote as Jesus as a servant, as a prophet. He offers a vision, a version that moves quickly through the gospel, moves quickly through Jesus' life as a servant and a prophet. Because the Romans, and he's writing to the Romans, they don't care about Jesus' history. They want to know who he is, what he's doing, and what he's about. And so he writes it a little bit differently. Luke is, he's a Gentile doctor. And so he writes it differently as well because he's writing to people that don't know a lot about God, that don't know a lot about the history, don't know, they wouldn't be able to quote the Bible, the Old Testament, like the Jews would. And so he writes from a different perspective and spends a lot of time on the idea of God being the Son of Man. Then you have the book of John. Scholars believe that the book of John was the last book that was written of the Gospels. There's over 92% of this book of John that is unique only to the book of John. You won't find it in any other of the Gospels, which is very interesting. It was also written 30 years after the other three. A couple facts about the Gospels. Matthew and John, they were the only two that were disciples of the 12. I grew up in church, and so I used to always think that the four guys that wrote the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were all disciples. Anybody else think that when they were younger? Yeah, well, it was only Matthew and John. Those were the only two that were disciples that spent time with Jesus for 3 years. Mark, he got all of his information from hanging out with those 12 disciples. He did a lot of traveling with Paul. Paul is another interesting guy. He didn't have the Gospels, but yet God spoke to him on a donkey. Most of you know this story. Paul was on a journey to kill Christians, to annihilate Jesus' message. He didn't think Jesus was a Messiah. He thought Jesus was a lunatic. He thought his message needed to be outed. And so Paul was on a mission. And God spoke to him and said, you need to stop killing my Christians and persecuting my people and join us. And Paul did that. And he ended up hanging out with the disciples, Peter and all of them, for several days and weeks and months, learning about Jesus and learning about his love. And that's who Mark hung out with. Mark hung out with the disciples, and he hung out with Paul. Mark is also, this book is also to be believed to have been the first book in the Bible, or first book of the Gospels that was written. There are all but 31 verses of this book referenced in the other books. So out of all the chapters, out of all the verses, there's only 31 that are mentioned anywhere else. Luke, like I said, he was a doctor. Mark, he hung out with Paul like Mark did. He also wrote the book of Acts. If you break down the Bible into sections, Acts is also linked in with the Gospels. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts together. Luke and Acts a lot of times go together because Luke wrote both of those books. And Luke focused a lot of time on Jesus being 100% man and 100% God. He lists a ton of facts, like good doctors do. Anybody go to the doctor and your doctor spends more time on the laptop taking notes than talking to you? I mean, that's my doctor. He's like, you're like, are you hearing anything I'm saying? And then he recites back everything that I've said. It's like, oh my gosh. It's like you're in the office for 20 minutes. He only really talks to you for 5. He's got good notes. And that's what Luke is doing through his book, is he's taking good notes because he didn't interact with Jesus. He was interacting with the disciples. He interacted with Paul. And so he asked a lot of questions, got a lot of details, and listed all the facts. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all written around the same time frame, 55 to 65. John was written from 85 to 90. There are also 322 Old Testament prophecies in the Gospels that Jesus fulfills. I find that very interesting. Because when you think about prophecies, you think about God, and you think about the prophecies that God was getting the prophets to tell. You think about Jesus coming on the scene. Jesus, as a man, as being 100% man and 100% God, he didn't have control over where he was born, right? Anybody else have that control? Anybody else have control who your mom is? No. But yet these prophecies were foretold about Jesus hundreds of years beforehand, and yet in the Gospels, he's born of a virgin, he's born in Bethlehem, he's born at a certain time of the year, he's born with all these other circumstances. Jesus fulfills 322 prophecies that were told hundreds of years beforehand. You also have what I would say is the climax of the entire Bible. John 17:1, it says, after saying all these things, Jesus looked up to heaven and says, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son so he can give glory back to you. I think that this is probably one of the climaxes in the whole Bible. And let me explain the climax this way. Have you ever been listening to a story and maybe you doze off, or maybe you have ADD like me and you come and go out, in and out of the story, kind of like I'm doing now. I'm coming in and out. And so you have this story that's being told and you're kind of not paying attention, but you are paying attention. And you get to the end of the story and you think you know all the facts. And you're like, oh, okay, so this is what happened, this is what happened. And then someone interjects the piece that you're missing. And that piece changes everything about the story. It's kind of like one time I was cooking a meal that we've had many times. And I cooked this meal, and it was chicken stuffed potatoes. Yeah. And I've cooked it many times. My wife and kids were out of town or away at the time. They came home, and we sat down to eat it. And my wife's like, something's different. Something's different about this meal. I was like, I followed the recipe. I've cooked it before. I followed it, but like I said, I have ADD, probably had SportsCenter on, probably had music going, and come to find out, I had forgotten to cook the potatoes. And so we were eating chicken that was stuffed in the raw potato. And my wife's like, it's good, but you're missing a key piece. And we've had this dish many times before. And it changed everything about the taste, the texture, the smell, everything about it. And that's what I think the Gospels does to the entire Bible. It changes everything about it. Changes everything about it. If the Gospels were never written, we would be reading the Bible completely different today. We would. If the Gospels were never written. Because God in the flesh appears. Jesus, the hero of the entire Bible, shows up on the scene. The guy that they've been talking about for 3,400 years is now present. You can eat with him. You can talk with him. 3,400 years, and he's here, sitting across the table from these guys. The Gospels change everything. These 4 books in the Bible change so much of how we read the entire Bible. Because oftentimes, I do this as well. Often we read the Bible as isolated stories. We read about Noah and the ark. We read about David and Goliath. We read about all these great stories in the Old Testament. You know, when Tessie, my 5-year-old daughter, gets in the car after church, we're like, what'd you learn? And she's like, we learned about David. We learned about this. We learned about that. And we go over the story, and we read and tell these stories as isolated stories from the Bible. But I don't know if that's how God really wants us to interpret the Old Testament. Because Jesus changes everything. That when you read the story of Adam and Eve, if you read the story of Adam and Eve without the Gospels, you would read it differently. You would read about Adam and Eve sinning and bringing destruction into this world through the sin that they committed in the Garden of Eden. And you would say, man, that stinks. It's over. And then you see in Genesis 3:15 where God says, but there will be hope. And before the Gospels, the prophets and the people writing this and reading this would read that and be like, what does that mean? What does that mean that there will be hope? That the serpent's head will be crushed? So the Gospel changes how we read the story of Adam and Eve. Then you have like the story of Noah. Great story. Great story for my daughter to reminisce about and talk about in the car. But as an isolated story, it's kind of sad that Noah had to build an ark to save human race. And he did. We're grateful. But when you read that, you're like, it's really sad that he had to do that. But what Noah's story points to is the fact that one day there will be somebody else to come and save human race again. But this time he will save it eternally, not physically. The Gospels change how you read the Bible. Abraham and Isaac. It's another great story. A little weird to read about Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac. In case you don't know, Abraham was the father of the nation of Israel. And God spoke to him and says, I know you're old. I know you haven't had any kids, but I'm going to give you a kid. And you're going to be the father of many people. And finally, Isaac is born. And after Isaac is born, God speaks to Abraham and says, I need you to take your one and only son and go to the top of the mountain and sacrifice him. And so Abraham packs the bag, packs his son up, goes to the top, and right before he sacrifices him, they see a ram in the bush that God provides for him to sacrifice. When you read that story, you're like, yay, there's a ram. Abraham doesn't have to kill him. He's a sacrifice. And you read that story as an isolated story, you're like, okay. But then when you read the Gospels, you see that Jesus is the ram, that Jesus is the sheep, that he comes and he sacrifices for us. The Gospels change everything on how we read the rest of the Bible. How I explain the Bible to students is everything in the Old Testament, all those stories, because the Bible is a history book, but it's not a history book like if you go to world history or American history class and you're going to learn everything about history. You're only going to learn the pieces that are important to the main story being Jesus. And so everything in the Old Testament, all the stories, all the genealogies, all the death, the murder, the sex, all of that stuff all points to the Gospels. Everything is building, it's culminating, it's growing to the Gospels. And then the Gospels happen. Jesus comes on the scene and he lives for 33 years and dies on the cross. The Gospels happen. And then everything on the rest of the New Testament is pointing back to the Gospels and about Jesus' life and his death and his return. Everything we read in the Bible revolves around what happens through Jesus in the Gospels. Anticipation of the Messiah is woven throughout the entire Old Testament like a tapestry. There's no way to read the Old Testament at all and not see Jesus in the midst of it. And to not see his story and his sacrifice and why he's coming. And the hope that he brings. So the climax of the Bible is the moment when the work of Christ on the cross begins. When you think about it this way, Jesus' statement that the hour has come in John 17:1 marks everything there is to know about the Bible. That he was to come and die for our sins so that we could be restored. That's what happens in the Gospels. And when we have the Gospels, it changes how you read the rest of the Bible. Another fact about the Gospels is Jesus choosing the 12 disciples. So often when we read about these 12 guys in the Gospels, you read them with a rose-colored glasses because we know they're in story. We know that they become great. We know that they do all these phenomenal and wonderful things for the early church. We know that. And so we read over their rough spots and over their failures and their bumps. We read over it. But when Jesus walked up to them and says, "Follow me," they were a joke. They were passed up on by several other people. They were a joke. A joke in most likely every way, in their lifestyle, their vocabulary, and socially. Like Pastor Steve said a few weeks ago, the Bible is an honest story that doesn't always paint people with the best paint strokes. And Jesus picked people that failed him, questioned him, annoyed him, didn't listen to him, betrayed him, and walked away from him. I often say that Jesus was the first youth pastor. And yet, when Jesus rose from death, even though almost all of them betrayed him, left him. He sought them out. In John 20, you see him calling for them, which goes back to the God of the Old Testament. That every time the Israelites messed up, every time the Israelites failed, and they would call for him, God, come rescue us. He would say, okay, I'm here. Over and over and over. And the thing that I love about the Bible, and in particular the aspect of Jesus choosing us, is Jesus chooses us to come along in the journey. Because, think about it. God, he's God. He could have done all of this on his own, right? That I don't have to be up here sharing this with you. He didn't have to choose the 12 disciples. God didn't have to use prophets in the Old Testament. But he chooses them, to use them, to ask them, invite them to be a part of the journey, to be a part of something greater, to be a part of something better than they would be able to do on their own. The reason why I know that this journey is great is because that happened to me. That's happened to a lot of you in here. You read something, you heard something, you got invited to be a part of something bigger, to be a part of something better. To walk away from our old life and to live differently. To join something that only God could orchestrate. And I bet the disciples would have said the same thing. In a way, they kind of did, because after Jesus died, they kind of went on their own. They kind of hung their heads, and they kind of went back to their old lifestyle. Some went back to fishing. They were moping around. They weren't doing what Jesus instructed them to do. And they were kind of just, what are we going to do now? And when Jesus seeks them out, when Jesus resurrects and comes, and it's like all of a sudden light bulb goes off. And the past 3.5 years made sense to them. Everything that he said, when they would go, what does he mean by this? What do you mean you're going to die and 3 days later you're going to raise? It made sense. It made so much sense that these guys, these disciples were willing to be a part of God's story, so much so that they died for his story. That the journey that they were on led to death. And they did so willingly. When we read the Gospels, it changes us. It changes how we interpret the rest of Scripture. That they're not just stories that reflect how you're supposed to live. They're stories that point to the Messiah. They're stories that reflect hope, power in our lives. That's what the Gospels are about. Let's stand as we close. I'm going to have the elders come down. The Gospels change everything. They change everything. And over the next 10 weeks, I have a few challenges for you. My challenge to you over the next 10 weeks is to actually read the Gospels. To read the 4 books over the next few weeks. It's my challenge. To not just come and listen to myself or Pastor Steve or anybody else that comes up here and teaches about the Gospels, that you'll come and you've read. You've prepared yourself. And as you read, pay attention to how Jesus chooses the disciples and how he chooses them over and over, again and again. Pay attention to that. Read the stories and be moved by what Jesus says and what he does. Be changed by the impact that these Gospels were intended to do. And read them as an invitation to something greater. Maybe you've been coming to church your whole life, And you're like, what could be greater than what we have now? You're missing out. You're missing out if you think what you have today is what God has in store for tomorrow. That God has something bigger and better and grander than you could have ever imagined. And so when you read the Gospels, read it as an invitation for change. Read it as an invitation, as a journey, as a challenge to grow, to sacrifice, to love more and more and more. Maybe today this is your first time here. I challenge you to spend the next couple of weeks just reading the Gospels. Maybe you've never read the Bible. Maybe you've read it before. Maybe you grew up in church and you've been away for a while. My challenge to you is to open up and just start reading just the Gospels. Read it differently than you've ever read before. Read it as an invitation to something greater. And when Jesus died on the cross in the Bible, he was dying for you. And when Jesus calls the disciples and say, follow me, he was calling us. He was saying to us, follow me. Follow me. I have something better for you. I have something bigger for you. The Gospels are yet another opportunity for us to join in on God's work, to be moved and work alongside him in telling the world about his love. And this morning, I want to close with us singing a few songs in worship and giving you the opportunity to participate in communion and to seek prayer. Maybe you need a hero in your life. But so often we look for other things to be heroes in our life. Money, jobs, relationships, and they always fail us. Maybe today you need a hero to show up and be real. Maybe you got something going on in your life that you just need prayer for. And you need God to speak into your life and change it. This morning is the opportunity to do that, to join in on God's bigger story. So take this opportunity and do that this morning.